According to recent research, the COVID-19 pandemic has had a disastrous effect on Africa's economy. Now, with the GDP falling by 3.4% in 2020, with a $150 billion loss in economic activity, this is the region's worst economic performance in more than 50 years. The World Bank further revealed that Sub-Saharan Africa's economic growth rose a bit and then dropped to 3.6% in 2022 from 4.1% in 2021 and is expected to dip to 3.1% in 2023. Global economic sluggishness, lingering inflation and tough financial conditions with high debt were said to have contributed to this decline. In this context, taxation is becoming a focal point of discourse as an emerging key tool for building more sustainable and resilient African economy in the post-COVID era, and by generating domestic revenue and reducing dependence on external sources of financing. Taxation is set to help African countries achieve greater fiscal stability and sustainability over the long term. Let's also tell you that recent data has confirmed that there is a significant potential for African countries to increase domestic revenue mobilization through taxation. And according to the African Development Bank, Africa's tax to GDP ratio is only around 16% compared to an average of 34% in advanced economies and 22% in other developing economies. Now, major institutions now driving this conversation are the Tax Justice Network Africa and the West African Tax Administration Forum, as they play crucial roles in building African economies through taxation post-COVID. So by improving tax administration, strengthening tax compliance, and broadening the tax base, African countries can increase domestic revenue mobilization, as it were, reduce reliance on external financing, and accelerate the post-COVID-19 economic recovery process. On this segment, New Central Television and West African Tax Administration Forum are partnering to focus on tax administration across the continent and to bring the challenges, solutions, and gains of taxation to the fore. Joining me this morning on the conversation is Chenai Mukumba, an Acting Executive Director, Policy Research and Advocacy Manager, Tax Justice Network. Nice to have you join us, Chenai.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Now, after a decade of success in terms of domestic revenue mobilization, an OECD report came out to say that tax revenues in Africa declined in 2019 and 2020 as a result of COVID-19. So we understand the issues surrounding the declines of these revenues, but I'd like you to just enunciate further and explain to us what were these factors and what role did they play in the decline of the revenues. I'm looking at the average GDP ratio in terms of what it obtains with the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. What we saw as a result of the COVID pandemic really was just a general economic slowdown globally, right? And so as a result, many African governments were not able to engage in various economic activities and as a result be able to generate the revenues that they required, right? And so what we saw was a decline in revenue in all countries around the world. But of course, African countries, particularly given the state of many of our economies, we were most hardly hit by the impacts of COVID-19. And so that's where you started to see the decline in, what had been an increasing trend of revenues, particularly for African countries, really just because of the slowdown that didn't enable us to engage in, productive economic activities to generate that revenue.
All right, you monitored the measures and processes taken on by tax administrations in Africa and, of course, other organizations, international organizations, to mitigate and curb the effect of COVID-19 on African economies. So which countries would you say got it right in terms of the measures put forward, and which other countries would you say struggled?
So, it was interesting. Different countries used different approaches in order to mitigate the negative impacts of COVID-19. So, for example, there were some countries that would reduce their corporate income tax rates. In Kenya, for example, they reduced it from 30 to 25%. We saw some countries where they put in place tax deferrals specifically to various sectors, particularly those that were most hard hit by the pandemic, in countries like Sierra Leone, for example, did so in their tourism sector, the hospitality sector. And then we also saw other countries, for example, in South Africa, where they were, for example, engaging in tax deferrals for countries such as in payee. In Nigeria specifically, we saw the extension of timelines for filing tax. And all of these were different efforts that countries were really doing the best that they could to try and address the negative impacts of the pandemic.
You talked about tax deferrals and other measures put in place by the tax administrations in different African countries. But would you say that these measures were well thought out? Were they well implemented? Did they meet their targets with the taxpayers in mind?
I mean, this is a really good question. As an institution, our primary focus of the work that we do is to put in place policies that we think are pro-poor, right? And so, specifically your question, framed within the work that we do is, were some of the measures most beneficial for the most vulnerable within our citizens? And so I think what we saw, as I mentioned earlier, was that many of these measures were putting in place really to soften particularly corporates, right? And so, for example, over half of the total relief package in South Africa was targeted towards companies, right? We saw a lot less of the money that we would have wanted to see targeting individuals going to, particularly vulnerable and marginalized communities. We also didn't really see, for example, very gender-sensitive policies, understanding that those who were most negatively affected by COVID were women, for example. And so I think in that sense, it depends on who you think most needed that support. Corporates got most of it, but we really would have liked it to see a lot more of it be targeted towards the average person in each of the different countries that were going through this particular process.
All right, now, despite revolutionary innovations by tax administrators for the tax system or within the tax system, and of course, the amount of money that they were able to generate in terms of tax collection, we'll still discover that when you look at some African countries, the citizens are said to still believe in abject poverty, as it were. But then we'd like to understand, where is the disconnect between tax generated revenues and the squalor, deprivation, and hardships that African citizens still get to live through and experience? What's the problem in between there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a couple of things. First of all, in order to successfully address the poverty and the inequality that exists within many of our countries, we need to be able to generate that revenue, right? And so, like you spoke to earlier, we need to improve the capacity of many of our tax administrations to be able to do that. But more than that, it's also important that we think about how we generate those revenues, right? There are certain ways to generate revenue that actually see certain components of our society negatively affected, right? So even as we're generating revenue, we need to make sure that it's being done in a way that doesn't further impoverish particular groups within our societies, right? So there's a whole host of measures that nationally, internationally, that we can take to improve our revenue generation. But what's also most important, what's also particularly important is that whenever countries are not successfully generating resources domestically, it's not only a function of national level activities. Also, we operate within an international system. And so there is also a need, for example, to address several loopholes that exist within the international architecture that see some of this much needed revenue that we need leaving our countries, right? So it's a two-pronged approach. We need to strengthen a lot of our domestic systems, our tax administrations, but also we need to see various measures taken at an international level to address, for example, the destination of where, when money is leaving our countries, it ends up landing.
Yes, one of the ways by which revenue generation can be gotten through tax is widening the tax nets, and that would be lucrative if these tax administrative bodies, as it were, would look into the informal sector. It is said to be, the informal sector is said to be a gold mine, as it were, if that can be well plugged into. So how do you think that these tax administrative bodies can look into the informal sector to mine as much money as possible from there?
That's a really good question. But I think what's what's important to keep in mind whenever we're thinking about the informal sector, right, is that it's not a homogeneous sector, right? There are, for example, within the informal sector, different levels of people that are engaging within that economy, whom we have always said should be the target of various efforts by the tax administration, are particularly those that are intentionally engaging in the informal sector, primarily for the purposes of avoiding and evading tax, right? And so those should be the target, not, for example, the lady on the side of the street who, for example, is selling some vegetables. So it's important to be able to create that distinction. But secondly, even as we're thinking about expanding the tax base, what we also need to be targeting are, for example, those high net worth individuals, those multinational corporations that have access, for example, to various enablers, banking systems, lawyers, to funnel resources out of the country, right, and put it in tax havens, etc. We see targeting those groups as much more bang for your buck, really, in terms of the resources that you can get into your country. But I think it's important to ensure that even in that conversation about taxing the base, it's those people who are generating the most, those with a higher taxable capacity, who are being targeted.
Yes, another area that we need to look at is the fact that there have been conversations around African governments not doing enough in terms of economic diversification, and they're putting too much concentration and too much pressure on tax administration from offices and bodies. Now, the argument is that there's too much pressure on taxation, and it is affecting what is being generated in terms of revenue and affecting businesses and corporate individuals that these monies are being gotten from. Do you agree with that postulation? And do you think that the tax system has the financial capacity to drive Africa's economy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. I think it's also very nuanced. I completely agree that we need to have economies whereby we are improving the capacity of our private sector to improve their productivity. But it's interesting because a few weeks ago I was in Norway, for example, and Norway is considered to be one of the most wealthiest countries when you consider their GDP per capita. You would be shocked if I was to tell you that they tax their sort of oil companies at 70%, right? Yet these companies continue to operate within those economies. So I think it's important, when we have this conversation about tax, to recognize that it needs to be nuanced in the sense that, yes, we want to create an environment that is supportive of the private sector to generate revenue. But at the same time, it's important that those companies that are operating, particularly in African countries, and benefiting, right, from the various infrastructure and services provided by those economies, are subsequently also paying, their fair share of tax in support of the country from where they're generating that wealth.
All right. Another area that we also need to touch on is the issue of tax compliance and tax evasion. That's those two areas are major issues when it comes to revenue generation. For some people, they say, why do I need to pay tax if I don't trust the government to utilize that money for my benefit? And in other areas, some people will connive with tax officers and evade tax, and that also affects what comes into government. So how do you deal with these two areas also?
I mean, it's an interesting, point that you raised, because you are absolutely right. I think often a lot of citizens are not as tax compliant as they should be because of this issue. But at the end of the day, it's a double-edged sword, right? Because citizens are unable to receive the benefits that they would like, from their governments, often because the governments can't support the provision of many of these services because they don't have the revenue. What we need to try and do is improve what we call the social contract, right? In the same way that we are calling on citizens, that it's important for citizens to be compliant, it's also equally important that our governments are accountable, right, with the resources that they receive and are subsequently providing those services. What it means is that we need to work on both sides of that coin, right? Increased compliance on the part of citizens, but also at the same time, really call on governments to ensure that they're making the best use of the resources that they're receiving from the citizens. To the extent that they do that, they will see much more improved tax compliance, on the part of taxpayers.
All right, so finally, Chenai, if we have a magic wand and we could wish away something, that would be the issue of the COVID-19 pandemic, because it was a major issue for so many economies all over the world. And now we have even been told that we should prepare for future pandemics that may come up and would further debilitate economies, as it were. But then for Africa, what are those lessons that you think that tax administrators or administrations can learn so as to build a more resilient economy and a more stronger, robust tax system for Africa?
I think that's a really good question. And I say so because, research has shown that the COVID pandemic is really one of a series of various economic negative situations that we're going to be experiencing in the future, right? So I think if there's one thing COVID, the pandemic has shown us, is that we really need to find a way to find our economies much more resilient. In terms of what needs to be done, I think first and foremost, drawing from your previous question, yes, there needs to be, efforts on the part of tax administrations to improve the way that they work, build their capacity. But what we require in order to sufficiently mitigate the negative impacts here is a whole of government approach, right? So we need to see increased revenues being generated, being collected by our authorities, but at the same time, all of the other ministries that comprise our government also need to be playing their part, right, in order to ensure that they're strengthening our economies, so that the revenue that's being generated is being spent well. And so I think for me, a whole of government approach is what's most needed in order to really ensure that when we see, and not if, but when we see another difficult situation come across our countries, we're well prepared.
All right, thank you so much, Chenai. And we also hope that TJNA and, of course, WATAV will be able to help these African countries along this line, because what's expected is to have a well-connected, synergized operations in terms of tax generation, collection, as it were, that Africa can make do with to grow their economy. It's nice to have you around, Chenai.
Thank you.